Fair. There's another point here that's part of the peace plan, and that's reconstruction of Ukraine. There's a lot of frozen assets, Russian assets that were frozen in Belgium and the UK, and I think it was Japan. These are the main countries. But we're talking about the ones in Europe and using about $100 billion of these assets to rebuild Ukraine. And as part of that, and this is the weird part, I want to try to get your thoughts, is how the US is approaching this. Goes back to my earlier point, if we're seeing a decoupling in NATO, or at least just a relationship with Europe and the US strain. Part of that, the US gets half the returns that are made from these investments, the $100 billion invested to reconstruct Ukraine. Yeah. Europe gets none. And as part of the peace plan that Europe was not there to draft, so as a plan drafted by the US and Russia, Europe has also needs to invest another $100 billion. So the US invests nothing. They get half of the $100 billion of Russian frozen assets, and then Europe invests $100 billion. How is Europe, the US, the region, even Russia, going to look after a peace plan is reached, whether this one or a future one? How's the region going to look like? How's, I think the US has accepted a multipolar world in the way it's treating its allies, in the way it's treating NATO. I would love your take on it.
Well, just on the issue of the peace plan, the provision that you mentioned, I think it exposes that those claiming that this is all just a Russian wish list, as many critics of the peace deal, of this peace proposal have described it, are missing the boat. You think Russia wants to just give away over $100 billion in its frozen assets for Ukraine's reconstruction? Of course not. Like, that's not a Russian proposal at all. Neither is the proposal that Ukraine's military will be capped at 600,000. When if you look at the Istanbul peace accords that were drafted in the spring of 2022, it was a fraction of that. So this peace proposal, like the initial one from the Trump administration, contains actually proposals that I think Russia would never accept. So this idea that it's all Russian wishes and talking points, I think, is off base. In terms of how Europe will look, I think this proxy war has been a disaster for Europe. It's totally increased European dependence on the U.S. Energy costs have skyrocketed, in large part because Russian gas has been severely curtailed. Not entirely curtailed, but severely curtailed. Germany, which is sort of the economic engine of Europe, has been seriously hurt because it sort of built its economy on cheap Russian energy, which it's been denied in part because of the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. And you've had a lot of money go into the military, and you've had social welfare spending, which is, a European hallmark. Like, Europe's known around the world for its progressive social welfare policies, which I personally admire. That's been curtailed. And you have a lot of unrest and anxiety because of it. So Europe's future, I think, has been hurt by the proxy war in Ukraine and by subordinating itself to the U.S., which is more than happy to have European taxpayers buy U.S. weapons, and more than happy to have Europe now have to rely on more expensive American liquefied gas as a result of cutting off the cheap Russian energy that previously powered Europe.
But we also have Europe increasing defense spending. We saw today that Sweden is seeking 2,000-kilometer range cruise missiles that they would have never thought beforehand, being a neutral country. Could we see a future of Europe rearming and becoming a superpower again? Now that the US has kind of shown them that they will not always have their back, they will not always fight their wars. And obviously Russia has shown to be more adversarial than initially thought.
I suspect...
We're already seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect, just looking at how European leaders behave, Mark Rutte, the NATO Secretary General, calling Trump daddy, just how much they depend on the U.S. I suspect all these leaders pushing themselves to be even more subordinate to the U.S. I just don't know if they can afford, especially given the unrest they face from their own populations, if they continue to cut social welfare spending and the very real pressures that already exist on European economies, for them to be spending the amount of money it would take to become that military self-sufficient. I suspect they're going down the road of further dependence on the U.S., whether Trump wants that or not.
Talking about foreign policy, something else is happening that I haven't had time to follow closely, covering Ukraine, Russia, Gaza, and that's what's happening in Venezuela. So I've started looking into it more and more in recent weeks. Something unexpected, especially with Trump's initial approach of being the peace president and America first. How do you make sense of what's happening in Venezuela? Being a war on fentanyl doesn't make sense. 99% of fentanyl comes from Mexico. It flows through Mexico and is manufactured in Mexico. So it is looking more and more like a regime change. We have a member of Congress that said, it was today, Congresswoman Salazar said the following: Venezuela for the American oil companies will be a field day because it will be more than $1 trillion in economic activity. So essentially just said that this is for oil. Help us make sense of what's happening in Venezuela and what could happen in the region.
The driving factor in U.S. foreign policy is hegemony, maintaining hegemony, which includes controlling the world's most valuable resources. That's what the Iraq War was about. That's what so many U.S. conflicts have been about. And Venezuela has the largest oil reserves in the world, and it's outside of U.S. control. So therefore, it's been in the U.S. crosshairs going back more than 2 decades. Back under Hugo Chavez, the Venezuelan leader elected in the late 90s, there were 2 coup attempts backed by the U.S. And so this is a longstanding project. Trump in his first term picked it up himself, listening to people like Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton. They tried to impose a fake president, Juan Guaido, in part by stealing Venezuela's U.S.-based oil company, stealing its resources, and imposing crippling sanctions that devastated Venezuela's economy and caused the very same migrants that Donald Trump likes to demonize when he's running for office. And so now, back in office again, they're picking it up, this time by sending military assets to the region. And I think the hope there is that they'll put enough pressure on Venezuela through military threats, through sanctions, through psychological operations, that Venezuela will just collapse from within. But it hasn't happened yet because Venezuela has been dealing with this for a very, very long time. And Maduro seems to have the support of his military. So this is just the latest phase of a long-standing U.S. regime change campaign that has been going on in Venezuela for more than 20 years, and it's been going on around the world. And Latin America is especially important to the U.S. because it's the Western Hemisphere, and under the Monroe Doctrine, the U.S. basically treats every Latin American as a Latin America country as part of the U.S.'s backyard where it can do what it wants, and it doesn't like seeing people that are outside of U.S. control. It doesn't like seeing an alliance between Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua who pursue their own paths of development. Venezuela has been, previously provided back in better times. Venezuela was giving very generous oil subsidies to countries like Cuba, like Haiti. Venezuela was even under Chavez subsidizing heat for low-income Americans. It had a program to give energy to low-income Americans. And if you're a U.S. elite, you don't like this global South country doing that, providing an alternative model for you, because we're supposed to be the ones in charge. And so Trump abandoning his promises about stopping endless wars is just continuing